today is the story of the 1%. It's 1% of all of our bodies, which is made up of phosphorus. We find most of this phosphorus in our bones and our teeth, but our organism really needs phosphorus also to store energy in a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. Our body also needs phosphorus to make protein for the growth, maintenance, and repair of our cell and tissues. So it's a very important element. But there's more to that. And I hope everyone here had at least one meal in the last 24 hours. Because if you haven't, congratulations. You made it in the statistics for the 1 billion undernourished people in the world. But if you have, no matter what you ate, required phosphorus. Because phosphorus is one of the 3 main macronutrients used for plant growth in agriculture. So we need that to grow anything. So it doesn't matter if you're a vegan, if you're a vegetarian, if you eat meat 3 times a day like I do. That food needed phosphorus, and quite a lot of it. So where do we get all this phosphorus? If you asked me 100 years ago, I would say bird shit. 100 years ago, we got a lot of our phosphorus from something that's called guano, which is the bird shit, manure, and human excreta. But you see, some of the people before me brought in discussion how population really boomed in the last 100 years. And that requires that meant that our food production system needed to keep up with that, right? So in the early 20th century, we had the so-called green revolution in agriculture, which was nothing green, but that's how they call it. And people realized that if we stuck a lot of fertilizer in the soil, we can have higher yields. And that meant that we need more fertilizers, so we need more phosphorus. And that's when we started to mine phosphate rock, which you see in red in the graph. Now, phosphate rock is a mineral that we dig out of the ground, and then it's transported over long distances and processed through a very dirty process into fertilizers. And then we ship all these fertilizers around the world, we put it on our land, we produce our food, and we send it out. And you can see that today only 10% of our phosphorus comes from previous sources. 90% comes from phosphate rock. So you could ask me, like, how much do we need? Do we have enough? Can we feed ourselves? Can we feed future generations? And I could say, sure, if you have unlimited amounts of money, if you don't care about the environment, if you have no ethics, we can feed. But the reality is always a bit more complicated. Now, I will start with costs. So in order to process fertilizers from phosphate rock, we need a high quality phosphate rock. And fortunately, we don't have that much of that. So we're running out of high quality phosphate rock. And that means that soon enough, we start to dig deeper in the ground at higher financial and environmental costs to produce the fertilizers we need. And currently, we mine 230 million tons of this phosphate rock. If the quality is lower, we'll have to dig way more. So imagine what that does to the environment. And just to give you an example, it's not just about how deep we dig to get this phosphate rock, but also what is the cost of the other inputs that come into processing phosphate rock. So in 2007, 2008, we had an 800% increase in the price of phosphate rock, 800%. And that was partly due to a rise in oil prices. So oil used for energy, we need a lot of energy to process phosphate rock and to dig it out. Also sulfur, which is used in the processing of fertilizers, and labor costs. Now, fortunately, you might say, that crisis only lasted 1 or 2 years. But if it would have lasted longer, the consequences would have been different. Because while some countries have the money to pay for that, other countries don't. And that kind of brings me to the aspect of ownership. Who owns this phosphate rock? Now I want you to picture something. Imagine you're in a village. That village is isolated. You're one of the 200 inhabitants. And 3/4 of your food is sold by a vendor called Jim. Jim is a nice guy. But sometimes he does foolish things. He voted for Trump. He's pro-Brexit. And the thing I really dislike most is hanging out with Viktor Orban from Hungary. But you see, a lot of the people put up with that because they need the food Jim provides. Now other people don't, and they stand up to him. And they tell him, Jim, why do you do this? But those people need to make sure that they have where to get their food, that they don't annoy Jim too much, so then Jim doesn't sell them food. And also that they have the money to buy from other sources, right? Now I want you to take the story and realize that it's the story of the current fertilizer market, where Uncle Jim is Morocco. Morocco has 3/4 of the world's phosphate resources. At the moment, they control 25% of the phosphate market, but they're planning in only 5 years from now to control 50%. And there you go. Now, there is a bit of a problem with Morocco. 30 years ago, they invaded a country called Western Sahara. And there has been a conflict ever since. First, a violent conflict, and now it's kind of a diplomatic conflict. Now, a lot of the phosphorus that Morocco is exporting also comes from Western Sahara. And you can see on this map, there is a red line going through Western Sahara, and that's more than 2,000 kilometer military wall that Morocco built to separate 70% of the productive Western Sahara, so with all the resources, from the 30% of the really wasteland of Western Sahara where there's hardly any resource, and where there are a lot of refugees too. So the fact that Morocco is exploiting what many academics and legal experts call illegal exploitation under international law from Western Sahara poses not only an ethical question. So yeah, sure, we have phosphorus, but where do we get it and how do we get it? But also is an obstacle to really solve this conflict. There are generations of refugees that have been in refugee camps now for 30, 40 years. Now, it's not just that, it's also the environmental part. And I told you, of course, we know mining is a polluting process. Processing of phosphate rock to fertilizers is a very polluting process. But there's also more to that. There's the fact that we have 90% losses from mine to fork when it comes to phosphorus. 90%. And a lot of that 90% goes into our waterways. Because phosphorus, we put phosphorus in agricultural land and then it just leaks into the water bodies. Also, we have untreated wastewater that goes straight into the water bodies sometimes. And well, to be fair, I was very surprised that Reykjavik doesn't really have treatment plants. But what does that do? So when we have nutrients entering the water bodies, there's a process called eutrophication if the nutrient load is too high. So basically, you have a lot of nutrients, and then you have algae bloom. Algae love that. They love nutrients. So then you have all this expansion of algae bloom, and when the algae dies, they sink to the bottom. And when they sink to the bottom, they start decomposing. And in that process, they use oxygen. They use the oxygen that other marine life forms would otherwise use. And if you have eutrophication, like too high rates of eutrophication, then you can create what you see on this map, which is called dead zones. So there's hardly any marine life in those zones. And the latest United Nations report in 2019 estimates that we currently have 400 dead zones throughout the world, and the aggregated size of those dead zones is the size of the UK. So, all right, so there's this phosphorus resource. It's vital for our body, it's vital for our food, but ends up, as a waste. It has ethical, social, environmental issues to it. That's it, no? No, but what can we do, right? What can we do? Well, first of all, waste less food. If we waste less food, we need to produce less food. We need to put less phosphorus into the ground. And I won't tell you what to eat in terms of, be vegan, vegetarian, or eat a lot of meat. But I will tell you that if you eat sustainably produced food, so let's take organic farming, it's better for your body and it's better for the environment, because in this kind of farming systems, there's little or no phosphorus coming from mining, from phosphate rock. There's mostly organic phosphorus that comes from bird shit. Also, wastewater. I told you Reykjavik doesn't really have wastewater treatment plant. Well, take this up with your local authority. It's a shame. How can you just dump all this raw sewage into the ocean and think it's okay, no? And this will not only protect waterways, water bodies, but it would also allow us to develop technology to recycle this phosphorus and, put it back into the soil. And the last thing you can do is, just talk about it like I did now. Talk about it with your friends, talk about it with your family, and you know what? Try this as a bar pickup line, right? You go in a bar, you see someone you like, you just go at the bar next to him or her, and then you ask, hey, so do you know the story of phosphorus?